like there was a tug that was happening early on, but obviously something kind of took you away. So if you could just start us off with what happened in your life before Jesus.
So before Jesus, I remember being around 6 or 7, and there was a friend of mine. She was about my age, a year older than me. And she would come over from time to time. And I remember that eventually I ended up being sexually abused by her. And this abuse kind of didn't look like abuse, so I didn't have the words for it at the time because she introduced it to me like a game. So this game just, progressed to be something very sexual, very inappropriate. And I eventually took the game and began to share it with other kids, not really knowing that it was wrong. But something in me really, after those encounters, just made me feel dirty and ashamed and broken. And eventually I kind of like erased the part of my mind that realized that it had happened to me first. And I just kind of assumed that I went out of my way, like in my own like wickedness in my own head, to go do it to other kids. I began to look at myself like a monster, and like I was just, really just dirty in my head. And that's how I felt all the time. I just felt so unclean and just so dirty. So I began to kind of like push people away. And even as a young kid, I was very angry. I was very angry and I was very distrustful. And for a long time, I never admitted what had happened to me. So I didn't have a pinpoint for those emotions. I was just the mad kid, And as I got older, the effects of the abuse didn't go away, even though the memories had. So I started to become very like hypersexual, and I started to experiment with other kids in my classroom, primarily like females. I found around when I was like 8 or 9 that I was more inclined to be attracted to females. And it was just this overwhelming feeling that I would go home, I'd have dreams about girls, like they would be very sexual in nature. I would talk with these girls, I would go to like sleepovers and we would touch. It was things like that. This feeling made me feel just even worse. I remember just feeling dirty all the time. And at the time, like I knew what gay people were. Like my mom had kind of talked to me about it. Like God loves gay people, but he doesn't like the sin. And that didn't comfort me at all. In fact, I just felt worse. Like God doesn't like me. That's what I heard when I was a child. And I couldn't understand why I was attracted to women, but I just knew like this thought like is going to tear me away from God. So I kind of like buried it deep in me again, and I didn't really admit to any of that. So growing up, I was very sad. I was very depressed, and my parents actually ended up putting me in therapy just because of how angry and volatile I was as a kid, and they just didn't really understand why I was the way I was. Around that time, I began to get like diagnosed with things like OCD and depression just because I felt dirty all the time. So because of the abuse that had happened, I was obsessed with being clean. So I began to do things that would try to sate that cleanliness. And I was always washing my hands. I was overly like showering. Like I was just trying to feel clean because something in me just felt so dirty. And it showed. Like I was tormented every day, and my parents were really, really concerned. So they had put me in therapy. As I got older, nobody really knew like what to do with me. They were just like, she's a difficult child. That's just what she deals with. Those are her quirks. My mom used to tell me, is like, I felt God still in the picture, but I think there were certain things that began to remove how much I trusted him. And the abuse like weared away a little bit at that trust. And then when I'm like in middle school, I'm coming out as gay at this point, as bisexual. So then I'm like, well, God doesn't like me anyways. Like I'm gay. There's nothing else I could do to be in his good graces. So then it was like something else in me felt like God was already turning his face. By the time I got to high school, my sophomore year of high school, I was 15. There was a bully that I had who ended up beating me up like in a classroom, and this bullying didn't stop. Like it just increased, and it would follow me outside of school into my workplace. It followed me every hallway I'd walk down. Like there was people making comments, looking at me types of way, other people threatening me. And it was just this torment that made me want to shrink within myself. And it made me just want to like disappear and just not be seen ever. I just felt like, how was I ever going to get through this if nobody was there for me? And in that time, I felt abandoned. I felt abandoned by like my parents. I felt abandoned by like the teachers. They never did anything. They didn't stand up for me. The administration didn't seem to care that I was being bullied. Like nobody stood up for me. And at that point, I began to question God, because where are you? I'm over here, I'm hurting. It's not even just like emotional hurt at this point. I'm physically being hurt by others. Why are you not here? And I had been taught about this God who loves us, but this God didn't seem to be someone who loved if he was okay with what I was going through. And around this time, because I felt so abandoned, I was looking for comfort. And in searching for comfort, I began to experiment with drugs. And I remember this was the time that I began to drink and smoke. And at this point, I had already started diving into like pills like Xanax and Percocets. And I'm in high school and I was just miserable. I just wanted